It seems that there are a lot of questions asked of you, and it has to be said that every story that is told has the answer to the questions that have been posed. And you might have recognized that in asking the question, what is the relationship between our auric field or our subtle emanation, our energy field, and this stillness that we find now in every moment of our life, is really the same question that's been asked the last several weeks. And that is, how do the laws of life, all the laws of creation, work in relationship to this one law, this law that is called the Dharma, the Tao, the will of God, the purpose of life? In fact, they're the same question. But you'll also recognize that in several of the stories that have been told of late, that there is no focal point. There's no hero or heroine around which the story revolves. So the hero or the heroine can be seen to be the center or the cause of what's happening within the framework of the story. And there's a very great purpose in that. So in this story this morning, which allows a question to be asked, it allows us now to move into that space where we have the ability to be able to see and experience that there is no center, there's no fixed point, there's no center point around which everything revolves. So our analogy or our metaphor of the cyclone no longer fits the place we're at. We have to move on. It's a story about several men, but the first man in our story is called Ting. He was called Ting Siu Wan or something like this, but we'll just call him Ting. And he was a very wealthy and also benevolent man. He was a trader of sorts, but he had great largesse. He shared his wealth around substantially. But then one day someone came to his door to announce that he would have to go to the magistrate and answer certain accusations that had been brought against him. It was in fact an accusation brought by someone who was jealous of him. But this person who had initiated this was quite high up in the hierarchy of the community, so he was able to pull the strings to bring Ting in to answer these accusations. So Ting decided to leave. He just left. He left his family, he left his home, he left everything, and went off to a far distant place. But of course, in this far distant place he had nothing. And he was sitting in a coffee shop, really pondering his fate, when by happenstance he met a young man who was having coffee, sharing a table with him, and they got into conversation, and Ting told him, the young man, his story. The young man said, well, you know, I live in the house of my uncle, and we're not very rich, and my uncle is somewhat of a rover. He roams about, he's very social. But please come back to the house so we can offer you hospitality. So he went back to the house of this unknown man who was called Young, and he didn't meet the wife, but his needs were provided. He was given a bed to sleep on, his horse was given hay, and he was invited to stay in the house for as long as he cared to and needed to. Every day his horse was fed and he was provided with meals, but he never did meet the owner of the house or the master of the house. And when he asked, how can I say thank you to him, the nephew just said, oh, well, he's off, his business is that he has a little gambling den out. He makes a little money out of that to keep us going here. But he's also very social. He has a very wide network, and so we don't really see him too often. Now it came to Ting's attention, by messenger as these things do, that the person who was making the accusation against him had been transferred to another district. So there were nothing that he had to answer to anymore. So he went back to his home and resumed his life. But time went on, and the circumstances of Young and his family changed. He lost his little gambling den, and they became so poor that they hardly had enough food to put on the table. So one day, just in passing, Young's wife said to him, "Why don't you go and see Mr. Ting?" So he did. He made the journey to the place where Ting lived, and he was very ragged in his clothing. His shoes were falling apart. So when he was greeted at the gate by the servant, he was almost turned away. But Young told his story, and when Mr. Ting heard, "Oh, yes, of course, I remember. Invite him in." So Mr. Ting invited Mr. Young into the house and feasted him and feted him, gave him clothing, and of course Mr. Young was very grateful. And Mr. Ting said, "Stay as long as you like, you'll be well taken care of." But after a while, of course, Mr. Young was very concerned about his family, He said, thinking to himself, "I'm all right, but my family is starving back there. What's going to happen to them?" So he went to Mr. Ting and he said, "I'm so grateful for your hospitality and your help, but I'm worried about my family back there." He said, "Don't worry, it's all been taken care of." So Mr. Young took his leave and went back to his home. And there he found his wife, who had now a maidservant who was doing her every beckoning. And when Mr. Young asked, she said, "Oh, the day after you left, wagon loads came up to the door with food and clothing for us, and here we have an abundance. Our house is full." And after that, Mr. Young's life changed. He no longer had to go to his gambling den to make a little bit of money. In fact, before he'd left the house of Mr. Ting had arranged for a few of his friends to come together for a gambling session, and Mr. Young had made a killing, made many pieces of silver. He was set up for the rest of his life. And the story has an ending, and it starts with, "According to the teller of things strange." Now, if we were to complete this story, now in this place where the stillness allows us to view the laws of life in all its levels, dimensions, before and after? What is it that arises out of this story for us as an awareness